everyone. I am Melissa Forziat. I'm a keynote speaker and the host of this Halt and Catch Fire rewatch podcast. Now, when I speak, my topic is something that I call Take the Doughnut, which for me is another way to say carpe diem, go after the things that you want in life. Something that I wanted to do this year was to rewatch the show Halt and Catch Fire, but this time talk about it with other people. I thought I was talking about all of you, but then I started to be able to talk with people who worked on the show, which has been amazing. So we have another wonderful interview coming up today. Before we get into it, a quick housekeeping item. If you are brand new to the show and you want to keep it spoiler free up until the episode you're on, go check out the episode recaps. Those you can predict how far into the story we are at that point. But these interviews could be spoiler filled. So just be aware of that up front. We can drop any detail from any part of the show. So I just want to make sure you know that. But please stick around because we've got a really good guest coming up here. I'm so excited to introduce Michael Saltzman, who was a writer credited for episodes 302 and 307, but also co-executive producer throughout season 3. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So good to talk to you. You were the first writer on the show that I'm getting a chance to talk to about the writing process. So I'll have a ton of questions, and I gave you a heads up on that before we got going. But, before we get into any of that, what was your road to Halt and Catch Fire season 3? How did you get this job to begin with?
All right, well, depends on the long or short version. For most of my career, I was a sitcom writer. So I started on a show called Anything But Love with Richard Lewis and Jamie Lee Curtis. I was on Wings for 2 years, Murphy Brown for 4 years. I ran Murphy Brown. Then I worked on a bunch of other shows like The Naked Truth, which I redeveloped in its 3rd season. I did a talking baby show for CBS called Baby Bob. And gradually, the world of sitcoms was sort of disappearing. To put it in context, the year I was running The Naked Truth for NBC, I counted on the 4 major networks, and this is when there were 4 networks, nothing else, there were 64 multicam sitcoms, and the next year there were 16. So it was like watching, Still Mills in Pittsburgh close, and suddenly the people who worked in those were not finding work. So I saw a need to start diversifying what I could do and started dipping my toe into drama writing beyond just comedies. And so I did a few pilots that I started with. And one of them went to a friend of mine, Matt Weiner, who did Mad Men. And Matt had read the script I wrote and really liked it. And then sort of out of the blue asked if I wanted to be a consultant on season 5, consulting producer on season 5 of Mad Men. And of course I said, absolutely, which was a great experience. And that was my first drama that I was on. And after Mad Men was over and I was looking to go on to other shows, I kept not getting hired because they would read my specs and they were kind of like more light action hour oriented. They didn't justify the Mad Men credit. So I realized I had to write a spec script that would justify the credit, which I did. It almost got picked up by Netflix and then didn't, but then it became sort of my audition script for dramas. So Hell on Wheels was the first drama after Mad Men that hired me based on that script. And then Halt and Catch Fire was the second one. And I had seen the first season of Halt and Catch Fire and liked it, but wasn't exactly sure where it was going. And I had recorded the second season. And then when I got the call, they wanted to meet me for staffing on Halt and Catch Fire. I went, oh shoot, I haven't watched the second season yet. And I quickly binged the second season and was blown away and thought, wow, the show was good when it started. It got even better in its second season when they kind of moved the focus a little bit more to the women and off the men. And I was really impressed with what they had done because it's very rare to see a show kind of keep improving on that front where it just kind of starts at one level and kind of finds another level in the second season. And I really thought they did. So I went from kind of like, sure, I'll have the meeting to, oh, wow, I really want to work on this show. And then I had an interview with Chris Cantwell and Chris Rogers, who were great. It was a very enjoyable meeting. And they offered me the job soon after that. And that's how I got on.
Oh, what a journey and what an amazing story. And it's interesting to think of sort of having to audition for something with completely different material, in the way that you have to do it.
What you learn as a writer is that you can kind of reinvent yourself from time to time with whatever you write. So you might be viewed as one way or another based on your resume. And if you want to break out of that box and be seen in another light, you can always write your way out of it. I don't, again, the industry's changing radically, so who knows where things are going. But at least when Halt and Catch Fire was happening, it was great because that spec script that I wrote managed to justify the Mad Men credit and introduce me to them as someone who could write the kind of show they were looking to make.
Hmm. So certainly I'll have a lot of questions about writing, but I also wanted to touch on the fact that you have a co-executive producer credit for season 3. What does that mean? What does that entail?
Well, the way television writing credits basically work is they kind of represent your experience and to some degree your salary. So most writers will start off at the lowest level, which is a staff writer, or a story editor is the next level above staff writer. And then they historically had worked their way up from story editor to executive story editor to co-producer to producer to supervising producer, co-executive producer, and then executive producer. So a co-executive producer usually, and again, credit acceleration has happened recently with these shortened orders where you'll have someone go from story editor to co-executive producer and have worked on like 18 episodes. Whereas by the time I got to be co-executive producer, I'd worked on well over 100 plus episodes of TV, and kind of it demonstrates a kind of experience, knowledge of how it's done. Ideally, you're someone who they can depend on being able to hand in shootable drafts, contribute in the room, that you're basically producing at a high level, to not be cute with the term producing, but you're providing work at a high level, both in the room, on the set, in your scripts. And so a co-executive producer is usually, and sometimes they get elevated to executive producer after a certain point, they get a credit bump. But co-executive producer usually suggests that you have a lot of experience in the industry. You're someone that the executive producers can count on to provide a real steady source in the room, and be a real contributor. So that's usually what it entails. Different shows will have different things. Sometimes executive producers will start passing off responsibilities to people below them at co-exec producer. The year I was on Halt and Catch Fire was the first year that Chris and Chris were actually in charge of the show by themselves. So they were kind of in charge still of everything. They hadn't really handed off anything like when I was on Wings, for instance, or Murphy Brown, the exec producers started to kind of pull back a little bit and give more responsibility to the co-exec producer or supervising producer. And so shows vary with what level of responsibility they give to the people on staff, but co-EP is usually right below the showrunner.
Okay. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Going into season 3, this is a really interesting time to start on this show because there's a pattern now we're establishing where the show reinvents itself every season. But the writer's room had also reinvented itself. This was, you were coming in for the first time to this show, but so was sort of, a lot of the people who were writing for the show. What was that feeling like coming into an established show, but having so many people who were new to it around you?
It was a really exciting year to join the show. First of all, like I said, Chris and Chris had been working under the tutelage of Jonathan Lisko, who was an experienced showrunner. And Chris, and they can correct you if I get any of this wrong, I believe Halt and Catch Fire was basically a spec script they wrote to break into the industry. And people saw it and said, no, this is a show. And that almost never happened. It's happened a little more commonly in the streaming era where people kind of made that jump, but it rarely happens. And when it does, they tend to match the writers who have no show producing experience with an established showrunner who kind of teaches them the ropes. And Jonathan Lisko, from everything I was able to glean from Chris and Chris, was a wonderful tutor and mentor for them. And by the time they took over the show, I kept commenting to them throughout the year. I couldn't believe this was their first year running a show, because I'd run a show. I know how hard the job is. I thought they were doing an extraordinary job of just basically of inclusiveness, of collaboration, of a wonderful spirit in the room. They were just great. They were probably two of my favorite bosses to work for ever. They were just really good people and good bosses, and just ran a very, I'm trying to think of the term I would use. It was a very kind of calm, welcoming, enjoyable room to be in. And they really set the tone for that. A showrunner will always set the tone for the room, and they set a wonderful tone. And what was great is every writer on the show was new to the show. I mean, there was one writer, I believe, who was like kind of consulting at the beginning, who kind of had consulted prior, but then left to work on another show. So the core staff, the everyday staff, was all new to the show. I knew one writer, Lisa Albert, from working with her on Mad Men, and she was on Murphy Brown once with us as well. So she had a long career, and I knew her. But everyone else was new to me, and they were all great. I mean, it was just I'd say it's the only room I've been in where I've really liked and enjoyed every writer, thought their drafts were all really good and interesting, thought they all had good contributions in the room. It was probably the most collaborative room I've ever been in. And a lot of that was because of Chris and Chris. They were just very welcoming of ideas. They were not precious about anything. They were not hierarchical about anything. They'd listen to any pitch and they really would consider stuff. And they were great themselves too. They contributed, wonderful things in the room as well. Sometimes the showrunner, because you're having to hear everybody else, and I've been in this position too, it's hard to contribute your own ideas because you're kind of sifting through everybody else's. And Chris and Chris, maybe because they were a team, were able to have a really good balance of major contributions from them, wonderful contributions from the staff. I think everyone felt invested and engaged in the show. And like a piece of them was they owned a piece of it. Like they were stockholders in the show. They all really cared about the show and the characters. And with all humility, I really think season 3, as good as season 2 as much as season 2 had improved on season 1, I thought season 3 was even better than season 2. I was only on for season 3, and I felt season 4 maintained that level as well. But you really felt like you were building on what had happened before and just working to make it better and better. And the show sort of taking its theme from the title, Halt and Catch Fire, which is you burn everything down and start over, was really, that's a ballsy move creatively. Matt Weiner used to do that too. And I was always impressed because so much you get wed to what you've created. You don't want to ruin something that's working, or you want to hold on to things that have worked. And both Matt and Chris had this fearlessness in a way to sort of say, okay, we did that. Let's try something brand new now, which is scary. It's kind of, recreating yourself every year. And it's hard to do. It's incredibly rewarding when it works, but I was very impressed with it.
Walk us through the process of, so you've got this writer's room. What's the process to get something from you assemble in a room together to we've actually got episodes? I imagine you start with big picture. I don't even want to put words in your mouth on this. What is the process for this?
The process, again, and you only know the shows that you've worked on, and I'm sure some shows do it differently, but I would wager to bet most shows do this. Comedies did not, at least comedies that weren't arced out. Like when I did Murphy Brown, we had 22 to 24 episodes a year. We didn't have arcs. We just were trying to come up with storylines, like what's a funny episode. In drama, especially, and in network drama, that was more often the case. They were like standalone episodes, like a procedural, it was a standalone episode. They started emulating cable dramas that did this, where they started arcing out characters and giving them more kind of, storylines that covered a season and adding those elements. But like on Mad Men and on The Boys and on Halt and Catch Fire and Hell on Wheels, it's a very similar process, which is you start with, okay, where did we leave off last season? Where are the characters? Where are they right now? Are we jumping ahead in time? Is this continuing? How's the show starting? And then where is the season ending? Where do we want to see the characters? And this can vary from show to show. It can vary from season to season. You might hold to it, you might not. It might be very specific. It might be more of a feeling. Like, Matt Weiner on Mad Men would often have more of a feeling, like, Dawn starts here and I don't know how or why, but we end up at his childhood home, so, okay, so that's a journey we're going to figure out. And I'm trying to remember on Halt where, if we really truly had, and Chris will know this better than I did because they kind of helped come up with this, but where we were in terms of how the characters are going to land. I don't recall having a firm landing spot for the characters. I think in general, the landing spot was the internet, that we wanted to see that we were going to, the arc of the season was the founding of the internet and them trying to be in on the ground floor with that creation. And that was the kind of major arc that we had, and how the characters fit into it. So what Chris had, which is again like what other showrunners will have, is they sort of talked a bit at the beginning of the season about where the show had been and where they saw the show going. So the show had moved to California, at the end of season 2, and so we were clearly going to be in California and what was happening during that time. And so one of the first. So they were moving into sort of a cybersecurity thing that Joe was doing. And Joe was always the real enigma of the show. And I think more than any other character, would change from season to season. I think there was always a sense of who is Joe really? And we kind of, in season 3, started to embrace the fact that Joe was constantly in search of himself and reinventing himself. So in season 3, I think we landed on pretty quickly that Joe was going to have this new sort of Steve Jobs messianic kind of vibe to him. There was the beard, there was the kind of a, kind of quasi-religious ways he was speaking, very philosophical. I know the idea of Ryan came up very early, that he was going to have this acolyte following him around. I know that the conflict between Gordon and Joe was going to be front and center. That was going to drive that storyline, and the Donna Cameron storyline was, how that partnership was going to shake out, and the growth of their company was going to be a driving force. But because Joe was separated from the others, that was also how are they going to connect as well, was something that was coming up as we were discussing it. But I think Chris and Chris talked kind of in broad strokes. And I remember what we had to do at one point was pitch the season to the producers in the network and the studio, and lay things out. And that was Chris and Chris giving an incredibly comprehensive overview of the season. And then by that point, we had, I think, the first 3 stories broken. And so I remember me, Lisa Albert, and it might have been Allison Tatlock, or it could have been Mark, I can't remember, all kind of presented our episodes in kind of a rough pitch form to them, so they had a sense of what we were doing. But because we only had 10 episodes to do the season in, episode orders have kept shrinking. So in the network days it was 22, 24 episodes. On Mad Men it was 13. Halt was 10. When I did The Boys we had 8. So it just kept going down, and the pressure to fit as much story as you can in those episodes is paramount. You don't want to waste an episode. You don't want to leave something out that you want to do. But other than having that kind of generalized sense of here's where we're going with things, and maybe an idea for a specific episode, like, oh, we want to do an episode that's going to be an IPO episode or something to that effect. A lot of it was very kind of still loose and sort of pie in the sky and kind of open to let's see what we're going to come up with here.
How far before, let's say, filming starts on any episodes would you begin this process?
Episode 302 was shooting on the 21st. Yeah, it looks like around March is when we started shooting. So November, December, January, February. So like 4 months, 3 to 4 months roughly. In general, that's kind of typical. I'd say 3 months, 3 to 4 months is pretty typical when it comes to that. In terms of pre-production, in the network days, it was really scary because it was like a train that you couldn't, once it started going, you couldn't stop it. You were really stuck with things. I'm just checking one other thing, make sure I have information right. Okay, yeah. So anyways, yeah, so we had about 4 months, and the clock starts ticking because you not only have to have most of the season broken, or at least have a general idea where the season is going, you also had to, start writing episodes. So, you have an outline, you have a first draft, you have a second draft, and then the table draft, and then you're off to Atlanta to shoot, so production needs it sooner than later. So the one thing that's kind of sad is that, so let's say I was doing episode 302, for instance. So I'm off in Atlanta covering 302 for a couple weeks, but they haven't finished breaking this season yet. So say maybe they're breaking episodes 7 and 8 at that point. I'm not there for it, so I don't know what's happening. So, or maybe they're adjusting stuff. So stuff is changing, stuff is being come up with that I don't know what it is until I come back. So then there's a game of catch up where, we're doing that now. Oh, so Cameron's not doing this, she's doing that. Oh wow, I didn't know that. And then you're also not there to help shape it like you were in pre-production. And I think every writer experiences that sense of being left out at some point because you're so invested in it. You're such a part of crafting where the story is going that when the room moves on without you, you feel kind of left out and left behind a bit. But that's just the nature of production. Some shows, especially for shorter orders, have the luxury of having all the episodes written before they start shooting. But that I've never been on a show that did that. I've only been on shows that have kind of been still breaking the story while we start production.
Yeah. How was it decided that you would work on 302 and 307, or that those would be sort of your episodes?
Some of it's like kind of like a pitching rotation in baseball. The showrunners set the rotation. And Chris wrote the season opener. And I think because I had the most seniority as a co-EP, they put me in for episode 2. And that traditionally is how it goes. It kind of goes down the line of seniority. That's partly I don't know, an archaic sense of respect for the people and their experience. It's also a practical thing that you assume the people who have the most experience are going to have less work needed on their drafts. I will say this though, everyone on Halt and Catch Fire was able to pull their weight. Everyone turned in really, really good drafts. So Chris and Chris, either through luck of the draw or incredible insight into hiring writers, really picked a good staff. They really picked people who knew how to write. And that is rarely the case on the show. There's always one or two mistakes you make, you know, as a showrunner, where not mistakes is not a little unfair, but people who just don't get the voice of the show, or people who just don't write to the show, or the drafts just aren't as good as you think they're going to be. That's just like, you know, you rarely hit 1,000 when you're picking a staff. There's always a bit of a guesswork that goes into it. And yet they really, everyone was able to write a great draft. It was really fun when the drafts would come in, because you couldn't wait to see what someone had written, and we all had slightly different voices and strengths and weaknesses, and then we all would help each other. But yeah, they were all great. So I wrote 302 because I was like first up as co-EP.
Let's see. Next up was Lisa, then Allison, then Mark,
Okay,
Angelina.
I had Mark and Allison reversed. Yeah, and then Angela, right?
Yep, Angelina, and then back to
Angelina,
you.
I'm sorry, Angelina, sorry. Yeah, Angelina Burnett. So yeah, and yeah, so and each one was great. And so what happened with 307, it was kind of a slightly weird thing. Contractually, when they were negotiating my deal, they were asking for a certain amount of money that they weren't going to meet. And so the compromise that was made contractually was that I would be guaranteed 2 scripts. I don't think Chris and Chris were privy to this negotiation. So when 307 came up, they asked if I'd be willing to co-write it, I think with Allison, who was also there. In other words, they were trying to divvy up the scripts in as fair a fashion as possible. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to do it, but I should point out contractually, I get paid for 2 scripts. So, you know, you'd kind of be paying extra money for that. I said, I will do whatever you want and however you want. It's not, it doesn't matter to me, but just so you know, I am guaranteed that money regardless. And they were like, oh, we did not know that. So then they came back and said, okay, you write 307 and we're going to have Allison and Lisa, I think, co-write 308 is what happened.
Yep, they did
So
that.
it wasn't like I was trying to be a jerk about it. It was just I was guaranteed a certain thing and was going to get it either way. And I thought as producers, they didn't want to waste any money on it. So, you know, loving both Allison and Lisa, would have been happy to do anything with them. And I think the way they did when they co-wrote it, I just think they divided up storylines and then just, you know, that's how they did it. And it was a great episode 308, you know, too. I mean, there really wasn't a weak one in that season.
There really wasn't. Season 3 is just out of control. The one more process question before we get into any scenes. So this might be different from writer to writer, but at what point were you done with a script? Were you still, you know, editing it when filming was happening, or was it locked before that?
Even on set, you're still rewriting things. I mean, stuff will come up. An actor will have a problem with something. A director will say, I don't know how to shoot this, or can you cut this, or can you give me another line here? Or an actor will say, I'm not getting what this is at all, or I want to change this. There's a lot of stuff that happens on set, and some actors are more you know, willing to just go with what's written than others. You know, the cast of Halt were smart, you know, talented actors, very gifted actors, all had slightly different, you know, methods of going about things and dealing with the script. So until the script is shot, it's still technically in flux. Story's not going to change. You know, they might say, hey, we don't need this scene, or can you write a line to cover the fact that we're going to cut the scene if we're running out of filming days, and we realize we don't need to tell the story or something like that. It doesn't happen a ton, but it can. But mostly once you finish your second draft, usually you hand it in. The showrunner will then usually take a pass to make sure it's fitting with the voice of the show as they see it is. Some shows will do a table. I'm blanking now whether we actually had tables or not. I think we sort of had a table draft where we just would kind of go through things as a staff and people would have notes. I think that might happen, but maybe it didn't. I might be conflating different shows now. I mean, it was a very collaborative room, but I don't know if we had the time or energy where everyone went over the script in the room. They might have handed in notes perhaps to the Chris's. But either way, and the beauty of Chris and Chris is they didn't have a lot of ego in it. In other words, a lot of showrunners will, you know, out of necessity or a need to put their stamp or their hands all over everything. when I was a showrunner, if I had a script that came in and I liked it, I was delighted because it meant less work for me. I love not having to rewrite anything. That's my fantasy as a showrunner because it gives me a lot more time and gives me my life back. And what I really was impressed with Chris and Chris is if they liked something, they left it alone. So my first episode 302, there were two scenes that they rewrote a little bit, which were some of the venture capitalist investor scenes. They had a couple things they felt weren't quite how they wanted the language to be in it, so they kind of took a pass at those two scenes. They didn't change them a lot, but they just sort of adjusted some stuff that, I was totally fine with. But most everything else pretty much stayed as written. And then and then 307, nothing changed. It was one of those things where I got a note from Chris Rogers. He goes, I wish I had notes to change things. I'm just enjoying this too much it's just really delightful. So I think shoot it as is. So, that takes a real confidence and security as a showrunner to be able to say that, because especially for younger showrunners and their first time, they might feel insecure about that, or they might feel the need to. I just thought they had a real maturity that was beyond their experience that really impressed me. And I think part of that was demonstrating the fact that they trusted the writing staff and they trusted their taste and their judgment. If they read something and they liked it, they didn't need to put their hands all over it. They were like, I love this. This is great. I'm happy with this. And if they didn't, they would find a way to do it in a way that was not, as some showrunners can be, kind of hurtful or overly critical or nasty about it. It was all came from a place of trying to make the show as good as it can be. And as a writer on a show, you really, really appreciate and respect that. It really contributes to the general well-being of the show.
Yeah, this is great to hear. Let's actually get into your episodes. So
Sure.
For 302, a bunch of questions about 302. So for this one, it's called One Way or Another. There's some really interesting contrasts between old pairings of characters and new pairings of characters. I specifically, I think of a pairing like Donna and Cameron, who we've seen them together a bunch. But then when you get a pair like Ryan and Joe, who we're just figuring out what this looks like. So is there much of a difference for you in how you approach writing for a pairing we've seen before versus one that's just starting out?
That's an interesting question. I mean, more so even than that, what I would say is the difference between writing for characters that have been on the show, that the actors and can hear their voices in your head, and a character you're creating fresh that you haven't seen before. So when I'm writing Ryan, I don't know who's playing Ryan. I don't know who Ryan is yet. So you're kind of creating a character from scratch as you picture it. And I think we knew that we were picturing someone who is of Indian descent to play Ryan, so we kind of knew that. In my head, I was picturing Hassan Minhaj from The Daily Show. That was kind of my image of Ryan. And what was interesting is Manesh, who ended up playing Ryan, I actually had met at a friend's wedding like a year or so before. And so we kind of had known each other when it's on. So it was like, hey, yeah. And that was kind of wild that I'd actually already knew him. But I didn't know his voice, on the show when I'm writing that character. So but there is something fun when you mix and match. Being a comic book nerd, I describe it as like a superhero team up where, I've never seen Green Lantern and Batman together before. What's that dynamic like? There is something fun about being able to explore a new dynamic and what the characters' attitudes are. But the other thing is, like other shows I've worked on, so much of what the episode is going to be is hashed out as a group in the room. So everyone is pitched out on this story. It's all up on the board. I'm contributing to Lisa and Allison and Angelina's script, or Mark's script. They're contributing to my script. We're all throwing things out that are going to end up, and Chris are throwing things out or saying, hey, this is how I see this scene. I really want this perspective, or I really want this tone or this vibe or whatever. So it's not like you're creating whole cloth by yourself like you would be if you're just off on your own doing a movie or something. It's really a collaborative team effort. So by the time you go off an outline, you've got a pretty beaten out story on the boards that what each scene is supposed to be. And then in your outline, what you discover is, here's a problem we didn't anticipate, or wait a minute, this is contradicting itself, these two ideas. So the outline is kind of smoothing everything out and making sure that the story pieces all work together. And then I do know that the whole writing staff would look at the outlines and we'd all discuss the outlines. And we'd flag problem areas, or, that's too similar to this episode that we're doing, or, things of that nature. So by the time you go off on the actual script, you have a pretty good idea of what the scenes are supposed to be. But at the same time, there's still a lot of room for invention. and, you know, a lot of room to explore things. So, you know, I remember a scene I particularly enjoyed doing and had a sense of discovery on. It was the deposition scene that Gordon has with the lawyer. And I can't remember if this was a pitch in the room or this was something I came up with in writing. I think it was when I was writing it, to be honest. But the whole premise of that I love that drives the scene was this as a business partner or as a friend, because that got to the crux of their relationship. Were they friends or just partners? And I thought Scoot was phenomenal in that scene. And I remember having a debate with the director on how that scene was shot, because she had Joe coming in and kind of walking into the room and kind of taking over the room and sitting at the head of the table. And I remember telling her, I really think the way I saw this is it's a very intimate scene with him and Gordon, and he's using the physical closeness to intimidate him. So when he starts offering him the entire company and it's right there in his face and they're right on top of each other, it's a personal rejection. It's him coming in vulnerable, not coming in full of the strength and power of the show. And she got that immediately and said, "Oh yeah, okay, I got it." So she had him start kind of coming in with that and then move to Gordon.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you kind of ended up with you kind of split the difference on that. We had got
It
a
was a
little bit of both
compromise.
ideas.
I
Yeah.
wanted him to go straight to Gordon. She wanted him coming into the room the way she originally had it blocked, and then the compromise was then him moving to Gordon was how we landed on that.
Okay.
But you know, so that episode too, anytime you do a first episode of the show, you're kind of a virgin on the show, and you haven't written these characters. They're new in your head as you're formulating words for them. And so there's a bit of a kind of, it takes a little longer than your next script for a show because you're really trying to get the voices down. And I'd say one of my strengths as a writer is capturing voices. I'm something of a mimic, and so I do internalize voices pretty well and translate them. I'd say that's one of my strengths. And but at the same time, Joe was such an enigmatic character for me that kind of changed from season to season, that, you know, capturing that kind of, you know, kind of shaman like whatever persona he was taking on. Now, one of my favorite scenes to write in that episode was the scene with Ryan when he goes to pitch himself to Joe. And I that was a fun scene to write. And I kind of based that scene. I was the original writer on the Steve Martin Pink Panther film, and to get the job, I had to meet with Ivan Reitman, who was originally the producer of it, and was going to be maybe the director. That ended up not happening, but at the time he was in charge of the film. And so I had passed the first test, and then it was going for the audition with Ivan. And I just remember that being a meeting where everything I said was wrong. So one of the actual things like that I used to tell people about how the meeting, when I said, if he asked me, you know, he'd say, "Well, how old is Clouseau in the movie?" And I'd say 35. Wrong, he's 18. Okay. You know, is Kato in the movie? Yes. Wrong, he's not in the movie, or whatever it was. And it was like literally he said, "What color is the sky?" And I said blue, it'd be wrong. And so I actually used that way. Ivan didn't actually say that part, but that was kind of the tone. And when I'd encapsulate the meeting for people. So I actually used that line when he asked Ryan if I said the color of the sky, I'd say blue, you'd say wrong. And Joe's line is, it's actually overcast outside. And I just love the way that Joe, no matter what Ryan said, Joe had an answer that threw him off his game. And his speech about, you know, where he finally drops his facade or trying to please Joe and just breaks down and is honest with him was kind of an important speech, because we did not know that Ryan was, and spoiler alert, if anyone's watching, we didn't know Ryan was going to kill himself necessarily when we started the storyline. I think it was discussed. It was an idea that was thrown out, but it wasn't like this is definitely what was going to happen. It was still kind of up in the air when I was writing this episode, but I knew it was a possibility. And I thought this was kind of laying some of the groundwork for that if we went in that direction. I remember on set having an issue with that speech because I was trying to get a note to the actor where he was kind of really slowly doing the speech, and I tried to get the impression across that this is like you've just won the Oscar and you're trying to thank everybody in the world that you know, and they're playing you off with the music. And the director was like, "That's a terrible note to give him because now he thinks this is his Oscar-winning speech." I'm like, I don't see how that is interpreted any way at all. But what I discovered was this was the speech that he got the part with from the audition. And so he had a way of doing it that he feels is what got him the part. So he was a little resistant to doing it the way I was imagining the speech, which was, it's got to be a mile a minute spill your heart and soul out as quickly as you can, because you've got 30 seconds and then you're out on your ass. So that was a kind of push and pull on set where I don't feel we ever fully got the intensity of what I was hoping to get from that moment.
It's interesting because that is how I feel about Ryan. So I think you're so close to it that I don't know if you realize we actually landed on that effect. Maybe
It
not
got
to the
closer.
extent.
It got
Yeah.
closer, but it was a process. We must have done that scene 4 or 5, 6 times. It kept getting closer. It never got to quite the level I want, but eventually got within the ballpark where we were able to move on. But
Yeah.
I just love how Joe keeps him off guard in that. So that was a fun scene to write, where you think you can get in by kissing this guy's ass and just saying you're basically a hugest fan of the world and you want this job, and he's like, want or need. Joe is just constantly kind of keeping him off his game. And that to me was a fun scene and an insight into Joe. One of the things I felt was one of my best contributions on the show, or things that I would occasionally come up with, would be like when we were pitching out stories, would be a line that would just kind of inform a scene or inform an episode. And I think, I remember which episode, but there was some line of, I want to work with Joe McMillan, and Joe's line is, what makes you think I want to work with Joe McMillan? And I just pitched that in the room. And what I loved about it was such an insight into his character, because just the sort of self-hatred and the sense that he doesn't even know who he is. It just informed things in a way that, I like a room vibe where I can pitch stuff like that. And it's what sitcom has a lot of. It's that kind of pitching jokes or lines in the room and get to the heart of things. And so that was one of the things I took most pride in that year, was just there were moments where I was able to kind of come up with a line that just sort of crystallized or informed a character or a scene in a way that was helpful. So
it's one of my favorite lines of the series. I think he says, I can't work with Joe McMillan anymore. I pick a line of the episode every episode, but there are some lines of the episode that really just sort of stand out to me even beyond the others. And that was one of them.
This isn't from 302, but just to show you how stuff evolves, for instance. So we were pitching the beginning of stuff, and I think Chris's outline had come in maybe. And I had come up with just as a brief backstory, back in the early mid 90s, I had done a comedy series that was set in Silicon Valley at a video game company. And it was kind of way ahead of its time, and executives didn't get what Silicon Valley was. They didn't get that world. And it was just kind of a weird thing. But I'd done a lot of research and read a lot of books, which suddenly now were exactly the era we were in. And I had a bunch of research and ready-made access to material. So one of the things I mentioned was that Silicon Valley, the original name of the area that it's in, was known as the Valley of the Heart's Delight, which is what became the title of the episode. But the other thing that happened was we were going over the outline, and Jason Cahill, who's the writer who had been kind of on the show before but was moving on to something else, but was still kind of there for the first couple months as a kind of consultant position. And Jason kind of came in and said, I just feel you need something just kind of that happens, that feel like something radical that happens, that just, in the thing. And I pitched, what if it's an earthquake? Because that's San Francisco, and that there was that era that there was, and that kind of became the opener of the show. And my other pitch on episode is, they were doing this whole thing on cybersecurity and are you safe? That my pitch was to tie that into the AIDS epidemic that was going on, which became kind of a metaphor and obviously played through later in the episode and the season, where, are you safe had the double meaning of, is your computer safe and are you sexually safe? And I had a slightly odd role. Jason had a little bit of this when he was there, and Allison Tatlock were all sort of a similar age range. But we were sort of, and Lisa Albert too, for that matter. We were sort of the 80s and 90s historians, where, Chris and Chris were kind of born after the show takes place, the way Matt Weiner was on Mad Men too. And so I was in an unusual position of being in that era, I remember when this happened, or, you don't know what it was like, but when AIDS was happening, this was going on. I'd pitch stuff like, I remember one of the things where when they eat at a restaurant, I remember the first time I had risotto at an Italian restaurant around there. I'd never heard of risotto before, but suddenly it was everywhere when these new Italian restaurants were coming into the California area. Or things like, oh yeah, you never used to be able to pump your own gas and pay at the gas pump. That was a new thing that happened then. Just weird little kind of quirky things that were just part of my life, that I had never been in a position of, I am the official 90s historian suddenly, in the world. On Mad Men, we had people like Robert Towne and Frank Pearson, who had lived in the 60s who would kind of serve that function. And we kind of looked up to them and looked to them to offer some grounded stuff. They're like, what was it like? And I was kind of playing a little bit of that role on the show, which was sort of a weird position to be in all of a sudden.
Mm. Obviously, one of the things that happens on this show is we're going to get a lot of technical language. And
Yeah.
I did have a chance to interview Carl Ledbetter. So I know that there's some technical consulting happening. But for
Sure.
you, what does that relationship look like when you're actually writing a script?
It's really interesting. What's so funny is my oldest daughter actually works in cybersecurity now. She's in Boston working in cybersecurity, and we watched the show together. And after, I think it was after it aired, maybe because they were too young when we were doing it. But she knows all this thing. When she's watching one of the episodes that I wrote, she turns to me, she's like, "How do you know that? How did you know that?" And I said, "I don't know it. Not only do I not know it, I can't even tell you what he just said." My proudest moment writing a script is when we asked Carl, "Hey, we need something to do this kind of function in the story. What do you got for us?" And he'd say, "Oh, that would be this, this, and this." And he'd give us all this technical thing. I go, "Okay, great." Then I'd write the script and try and turn that into dialogue and integrate it into the scene. And then we'd send it to Carl to read. And I swear that the greatest compliment and high I could get was when Carl would read and say, "That's it. That's exactly right. That's how you'd say it. It's perfect." I'm like, yes, it was the best kind of note you could get that I actually got it right. And that's true on any show. We had advertising consultants on Mad Men. We had San Francisco Railroad historians, on Hell on Wheels. And, there's a kind of weird thing now in television hiring where people feel like you have to kind of be the thing you're writing. Like, we need a Muslim female chemist for this episode. It's like, no, you don't. You need a Muslim chemist, female, maybe consultant, but you don't need the writer to be the thing they're writing about necessarily, because you just don't. What you need is people who understand the characters and the humanity and can bring that knowledge. If you happen to have someone who's, like, say, a computer expert who's a great writer, sure, that's an added bonus, but that's what you hire consultants for. You don't have to be the thing you're writing. And there seems to be a sense that you kind of do now, but you really don't. You just have to have good research, and you have to have people you can have as consultants who can course correct you or tell you when you've got it right or wrong. Because that's kind of the beauty. Any technical knowledge we had was helpful. And Mark Lafferty, I think, had a little bit of technical knowledge more than, say, any of the other writers. I mean, I think Angelina, Allison, Lisa, and I had almost none. Chris, I think, had a little bit, and certainly a fascination with it. I think Chris Cantwell's father worked in the industry, but you bring one of my heroes is Stephen Sondheim, and he once said that people misunderstand what the term "write what you know" means. That write what you know doesn't mean if you work in a post office, write about a post office. It means write what you know to be emotionally true. And that's been kind of my North Star as a writer. And so when I write something, I want to be emotionally true to the world and the characters as I understand it. And then when there's technical stuff, like this show has a lot of technical stuff, that's what you lean on. And as long as you get that right and it's fitting into what the characters and their worldview and all that's working, and sometimes it works as a metaphor, for a character, some of the technical stuff, like anything can, it's really, it really helps enhance it and adds to the verisimilitude of the world. But sometimes just having a creative sense of possibility for what a character does, like what Cameron's video game that she creates might be, that's the important thing. Getting the technical stuff is just basically having someone like Carl, who's a consultant, who gives you that reality.
Yeah, absolutely. One other thing I want to ask about this episode, at the end of this episode, we're going to see Gordon's symptoms flare up a bit after a rough conversation that he has with Ryan. He stares in the final episode that we see, he stares up into the ceiling light, which sort of washes out the screen a bit.
Mm-hmm.
In season 4, we
Mm-hmm.
know that Gordon is going to die.
Right.
Somewhere along the way, there started to be this stylistic choice to show playing with light and lens flares
Mm-hmm.
as a way to cue that his illness is progressing.
Mm-hmm.
How much did you know that this was something that was being set up when you're doing 302? Because it's such a specific choice to get him looking up into the light. I don't know if that's something that you wrote in.
Yeah, it's the idea of Gordon dying was floated around season 3, and it was even floated about killing him off in season 3. None of us wanted to do that. We all really liked writing for Gordon. Is a great character and a delight to write his dialogue. And Scoot, is an amazing actor and just always enhanced it. So it was floated, and we knew that was on the table as a possibility. It was ultimately decided he wasn't going to die in season 3, but we were just also trying to find ways to indicate that he was dealing with this illness, whether he was going to die from it or not. And I honestly can't remember how the flare came up. It might have been a room pitch. I didn't come up with it on my own. I know that much. So it was either a room pitch or something that happened with the director on set to use it. I think it was probably in the script, and I think it was probably Chris and Chris's idea, maybe. Could have been Mark's. I don't remember specifically, honestly, so someone might have a better memory of how that came to be. I'm pretty sure it was scripted, though. I could double check the script if you wanted me to, but I know we were going to be doing things throughout the season just to indicate it, to keep, for lack of a term, keep the disease alive so that people didn't forget that he was having this issue. But it wasn't going to be the focus of the season, like it ultimately came in season 4.
This is really interesting to hear. I'm finding it so fascinating to sort of, know where the conversations were happening and how early they were. If we look at 307, let's really focus in. There's a cataclysmic board meeting for Mutiny that in the final episode is over 7 minutes of content. I'm sure it was a lot more footage, and it was probably cut down from there, but
really wasn't.
Wow. When you're writing, I mean, it's so intense, and you have to hold that intensity and keep, elevating the stakes of it. Talk to me about writing for that scene.
Well, you have zeroed in on one of my favorite scenes ever, and one of my favorite episodes ever. Most writers will have, usually their favorite episodes are ones that didn't change at all because it's their vision of it. And this is one that didn't change at all. There was I think maybe one scene that was cut in editing, perhaps, but the script wasn't touched, and I was incredibly proud of that. I was incredibly grateful to Chris and Chris for, again, having the confidence and security to just let it go. Like, I remember when Chris was going through the notes from, and they had a couple of small notes here and there. I don't mean to say that they had no thoughts in terms of changing. There were like a couple things, but I mean, they didn't have to take a pass at it. So in other words, there were changes between my first and second draft, mostly cuts because it was too long. But I just remember when Chris Rogers was kind of going through, he goes, I'm just reading this and enjoying it and don't see the need to change anything. It's just delightful. And that was so meaningful to me. And I just loved hearing that. So yes, there were changes between the first and second draft. But once I had the second draft, that pretty much became the shooting draft with very, very minor changes. And that scene in particular was one I was really proud of. And the whole episode, for one reason, New York Times, I was proud of it. New York Times called it one of the best episodes of, I guess it was 2016. And even though the New York Times, for some weird reason, didn't recognize the writer in the article, which annoyed me to no end, I was still incredibly honored and flattered that out of all the not only great episodes of TV that year, but great episodes on our series that year, they singled that one out. That was I was incredibly moved and touched by that. And it was one of those episodes that kind of turned out more or less how I visualized it. And we had a wonderful director, Karin Kusama, doing that episode. And again, I don't want to cast aspersions on other directors, but they have different ways of working. So, for instance, in the season, in episode 302, it was a big fight with me on set where there was the scene where Donna and Cameron are pitching to the venture capitalists. And we had this set and there was couches and chairs. And that was where I assumed the pitch would take place. And the director for that episode had them standing at the foot of the desk of the venture capitalist. And the actors came to me and said, wouldn't we be sitting down for this? I said, absolutely. But the director was like, I need motion. I need this. I can't just have them sitting and talking. And I said, I have never been in a pitch meeting, never seen a pitch meeting where you're just standing and talking. They're just sitting there in a chair. That's just not how that works. It's not real. And I couldn't win that argument. And it becomes that thing where we're going to lose the day. And so you have to let it go sometimes. But I was really unhappy about that choice because it made no sense to me and it wasn't real. And what I loved about the way Karin did that boardroom scene in 307, which, as you point, was 7 minutes, was mostly people sitting at a table. There weren't any histrionics with the camera. There wasn't a lot of camera movement and fancy moves. It was letting the actors and the words carry the scene. And that, to me, is so much of what television often is, that differentiates from movies. It's letting those scenes play. That's not about the camera movement and not about the director showing off, but about the director finding the best way to tell the story. And she just let the actors carry that scene, and the actors were unbelievable in that scene. So that scene was one of my favorites to write. And it's one of those episodes where you go, okay, and then they have a big debate about whether to go do it, keep the company private or take it as an IPO. And most people will be like, oh God, that just sounds deadly dull. And I kind of love those challenges. Like, this sounds like it's probably going to be a dull scene. How do I make it pop? And the key to me was when Chris Rogers, at one point when we were pitching the story out, said, and I think at this point it just becomes ad hoc insults and attacks of people. And I'm like, thank you. I know how to write the scene now. And because that's to me, that's like, once I have people just doing ad hoc insults and attacks, I'm in my happy place. So that scene was me doing a lot of research and reading on pros and cons of IPOs and private companies. And then really thinking about which each character's attitude and position was coming in, and just kind of finding the rhythm of Cameron and Donna trying to be nice. It starts with that, they're being polite, they're being respectful, but there's still an edge where each one has the problem that's been brewing with each other all season. And then it's each one pushes their case. Cameron knows that I'm blanking on the female venture capitalist, Diane. Cameron knows that Diane has been in Donna's corner, so she's aware of that. She's just had the scene with Gordon where she thinks Gordon's going to be perhaps on her side. There's all these politics and coalitions that are bubbling beneath the surface. And then once you get the basic arguments of pros, cons versus keeping the company private or going public with it, and there's like, I'm trying to remember what the first personal attack line is.
I just asked that question to the audience. I was just doing the recap, and I'm getting all different answers.
It might be
Cameron says something about "don't patronize me," but Donna goes ahead and attacks Cam's marriage, and that's like the first moment where it's like really clear.
Yeah, it's like, don't patronize me. It might be first, manipulate me like you always do. And then
then Donna makes a note about her being a petulant child, holding the company hostage.
I think that gets a little later in the heat.
Yeah.
I know Cameron makes some comment that insults the marriage with Donna and Gordon. And then Dawn says, don't lecture me about marriage to someone who just got, about, I think we're seeing what we're celebrating right outside. And Cameron's like, oh, that bullshit party you threw. So then it starts flaring with that. And one of the moments in the scene I love is when Boz slams the door or opens the door and says, let's end this before anyone says anything that's going to be hurtful, get a beat. And you think that's going to be in the scene. And Cameron, with that slam of the door, that loud reverberating slam of the door, says, no, we're selling this right here, right now, cards on the table kind of thing. And I just love how this scene starts with a thing that you think is about them working their problems out and becomes the breakup of this relationship. And it's so, and God, Mackenzie is so, everyone's amazing in it, but Mackenzie, God, that you just, your heart, you just feel her. She's just lost the thing that she cared most. It's devastating. And so it's one of those things where you write it and you feel it emotionally when you're writing it. And then when you get it on set and you see the actors just dig their teeth into it and the director just lets it unfold in what's the best way to just show this story happening without getting in the way and just letting the story unfold. It was such an amazing scene to watch. I just loved watching them perform it. It's one of my favorite scenes ever. And it's just, the actors are all fantastic. And it's just, it doesn't happen a lot in TV where you write something, it doesn't change. The actors and directors put it on its feet. It's even better than you pictured it. You see it finished and you're like, oh my God, it's even better than I imagined it being. It was one of the most exciting and rewarding episodes I've ever been involved in, and the way it came out and the response to it. The one scene that was cut actually was at the very end, and I know why it was cut. A lot of it's running time, and they just couldn't afford to have the scene in it at the end. But Cameron Mackenzie was so good in it. But basically, it was the last scene of the episode. Or it was going to be the last scene of the episode, and we shot it. It was Mackenzie's kind of curled up on her couch, like almost like in a fetal position. And it's like kind of, that kind of twilight time where you've been asleep all day and you're kind of groggy and it's kind of just getting dark outside. And she kind of stumbles like in her t-shirt and underwear to the computer and just goes to log on to Mutiny. And she's not able to log on. She's been blocked. And it was a beautiful little, wordless moment that I loved. And she was so good with it. I understood why they had to cut it because the story was already told and it worked without it, but it was just such a beautiful little punctuation mark to the end of it. And but you already felt the redundancy of it was when she left the mutiny offices, you felt everything you need to feel. You knew it was over for her there.
Yeah.
That was just like the final nail in the coffin. So you didn't necessarily need it, but I did like it.
Oh,
But yeah,
wow.
that scene was just it was a joy to write. And the weird thing about writing that episode, just for any writers out there who get precious about their technique or their methods, I had to write that episode while we were doing a college tour on the East Coast for my daughter, the one who went into cybersecurity. No, I'm sorry, no, it was my younger daughter. So it was 2016, it's 2015. So now I'm forgetting which daughter it was. Anyways, we're on a college tour on the East Coast, and my wife's driving the rental car, and I'm on script, and I'm going to be out of town while I'm on script. So I'm on a laptop, sitting in the passenger seat. I remember going through some winding hills of I think it was Massachusetts I think we were visiting like Williams College, I think, and it was just really kind of far away and lost in the woods kind of thing on these curvy roads. And I'm sitting on a laptop trying not to get car sick doing this. And I think I was writing that scene at that moment. It was what I recall. So it was a scene I had to write almost the entire episode traveling, and it was just you just had to really kind of focus on it. And sometimes that can be helpful. I don't know, but it worked for this one. And this episode, the other scenes I love in this episode, I'll just go on about. I love the scene where Gordon goes to Joe's apartment. That was a scene I loved writing. It was Gordon, the power dynamic has shifted, and Joe has just offered him the company. He's trying to figure out why. What is Joe up to? And Joe is doing the one play that he thinks he can do, which is if he doesn't own the company, then he can't get sued or whatever. And he meanwhile has that abstract painting, whatever, murder board or whatever on the wall of the future internet that Gordon is able to suss out. And it's this cat and mouse thing with them where each one's trying to suss out the other. And I just love when Gordon clocks that mosaic or whatever that Joe has on the wall, and he has the line, he goes, it's an abstract. He goes, it's actually one of those paintings where you don't know what it is, but the more you look at it, the closer it comes into focus, which is him saying to Joe, I think I know what you're up to. And then when he leaves, I love the line, thanks for the company, which has the double meaning of the company's just given him in his presence, being with him as company. They both were great in that scene. I remember when Karin was staging it, there was a bit of kind of like, how do we stage it? What's the best way to do it? And I said, my take on this scene is that Gordon is Columbo, and he knows Joe's the murderer, and he's basically just trying to get him to admit it. And it was just such a fun scene to write, the back and forth of it and the playing around with things. And they performed the hell of it. They were great with it. So I love that scene, and I love the scene after that when Joe gives him the company and Gordon asks him to come on board. That was just a really moving scene to me, and I thought they performed that one perfectly. It was great. I mean, it was really a joyful episode to see come to life. I'm trying to think whether that was the one. There was a scene that was cut in one of the two episodes. I think it might have been 307 that we shot, where they're doing Gordon's doing a crossword puzzle in bed, and is having this, and Donna has just come back from a meeting. I'm blanking now whether it was 302 or 307. It's just one that was cut. It was an okay scene. It was not like a make or break scene, but I remember Scoot was having some issues with one of the elements of it. It's just whenever you lose a scene, you always kind of regret losing the scene, but it wasn't like a critical scene in it. But there were so many scenes I did love in that episode that it was kind of delightful to just kind of witness it come to life.
I want to go back to the board meeting scene for just a moment, because do you remember why it was decided that Boz votes to go forward with the IPO? He's just had this very emotional reconciliation with Cam. I think we're going to find after this episode that it was very much under duress that he voted that way. And he's he's kind of has some resentment towards Donna afterwards. But why in that moment does he choose that direction?
Let me go back in time and see if I can remember.
Yeah, it's really tricky.
I did love the scene that's right prior to that doesn't set it up too, with Cameron and Boz, or he says, you might not think of me as your father, but I think of you as a daughter. It's a very and look, Toby is one of my favorite actors in the world. He's just I just love him. He's just got such a lovely presence on screen, and just I just love the way he delivers things. And he killed that scene, and Mackenzie killed that scene. They're just so good and so moving to watch it. So they've had this reconciliation. As I recollect, I think and one of the things that makes the scene work, one of the many reasons the scene works so well for me is Boz is in an untenable position, which is he's romantically involved with Diane, so he's got that working for him. He's trying to be, objective, but he's obviously in Cameron's camp. But I think part of it is I think he really buys Donna's arguments over Cameron's arguments, and he's begging for compromise. He's begging for people to let this go. He's begging for Cameron to let it go. I think he doesn't think she has the winning hand. And he could technically have voted maybe. I'm trying to remember whether his votes are ultimately matter or not once everyone else goes against Cameron, if he has enough votes to win it or not. I think, but he says, "You're breaking my goddamn heart." I think he can't. I think part of it is his loyalty to Diane now. And I think part of it is his sense of what's right for the company. And that's at odds with his love for Cameron and wanting her to be happy and right. And that's why he's begging her to just let it go for now and compromise, or just let it go for the night and not bring it to a head. Because I think he knows in his gut and in his heart, that the right thing to do is the IPO. Part of it's financial, too. I mean, he's got a stake in the company, and he's lost a lot of money over the years, and he's got expenses and stuff. And I think he's doing what he thinks is in the best interest in the company and his personal relationships with Diane. And I mean, he's put in an impossible position, and he ultimately makes the decision that he doesn't want to have to make, and is angry at Cameron for putting him in that position, I think, as well, and that she's basically forcing an issue that he thinks doesn't have to happen right now, and that they probably could come up with a better solution if they just go to their corners like he suggests and cool off and not let the emotions, rule everything. And it's a horrible moment for him. And Toby plays that, they all play all of it. I mean, it's just, just the faces. And this is, again, I can't give Karin enough credit for not being concerned of, oh my God, I've got a 7-minute scene of people sitting around a table talking. That part of it is just letting that land so that when the drama builds, it gets more and more intense. And just so much of it's the actors' faces, and it doesn't have to be about anything else. Sometimes you need camera work. Sometimes you need to stage things in a dynamic fashion. Sometimes if you just trust the material and trust the actors, it has that power. And that's why it's one of my all-time favorite scenes. It's just the level of trust among everyone in that scene about the words and about their performances. And it kills me every time I see it. In fact, I just showed that scene. I went back to New Haven. I was invited to speak at a Yale Student Film Festival, and they asked me to bring some clips, and that's one of the ones I brought. And most of the people in the audience hadn't even seen the show, but they were just really taken with that scene. And that's what I love about it, is you don't even have to know anything about it. You just, the drama and the stakes of that scene. Everyone always, the cliche of network notes is, what are the stakes of the scene? The stakes are so high in that scene for everybody that you don't ever ask, what are the stakes? It's just if you come to that scene cold and have never even seen the show, you get it. And I remember when I was going to choose to show it, I was like, well, it kind of starts off a little slowly. And I was showing it to my wife, and she's like, I think you need to have it at the beginning, or else you don't see the build. And she was right. So it's amazing that it plays even out of context for people.
Is incredible. Yeah. And regarding Toby Huss, I have to say this. There's a sequence that he does in 302 that you wrote for with the Robo Butler, that on a deep dive, when I went back, I don't know that I've laughed so hard the entire year as I did watching those sequences. And what a very specific, it's so specific to the time period and to to that actor and everything about that. You write that.
That was a scene that was actually taken from my own life, that I pitched in the room. And when we were just kind of spitballing stuff, and the Chris's just loved it and said, that's got to be in the show at some point. And so we were looking for a place to put it. What happened in my life was in 1976, 77, whenever the Atari video game system came out, my dad bought that as a Christmas present. I didn't even know it existed. I had always wanted to have Pong. I was envious of all my friends who had Pong, and he brought this game home. Not only did it have Pong, it had like 10 other games you could play, Breakout and all these other games, tanks and all these games. It was the most amazing gift I'd ever gotten. And it was like, my dad was so proud of his gift giving prowess that he just This was just the best gift ever. So he felt he had to top himself the next year. And the next year he buys this robot butler. And we're like, what is this? He goes, this is great. And it's like, so, okay, so you've got to put the drinks on the tray. Then it comes over and then it's going, it gets to the carpet and just goes, and then spills the drinks all over the carpet. And I'm like, what the hell? It was the worst gift we ever got. And he was so angry about it because he was going to top the Atari video game system. And it was such a complete and utter failure. And everyone just jokingly for years said, well, it's no robot butler. And so when we were pitching just stuff from that period, I said, well, there's this robot butler episode for my life. And so we thought, yeah, Joni's Party is the perfect spot. And there was actually one take that I'm still upset that we didn't use. It was so, I can't even remember what it was, but it was just Toby had some line that he improvised that killed me on set. It was so funny. And then it wasn't in the final cut. I was like, oh, I wish that line, and I don't even remember what the line was, honestly, at this point, but it was even fun. It was even a funnier coda when it fell over, but he was just so funny with it and his kind of excitement over this lame gift. It was just, it was great. That was a real funny moment, but also getting it to work and fall properly and all that was a nightmare on set. That was taking
and it had to spark a couple times too.
Yeah, that was a whole thing on set. That was, you know, that's the kind of thing you write, you get excited about, you're thrilled that they've got basically it all working. And then when push comes to shove and the rubber hits the road and you're trying to get it on film and you're like, that's not working quite right. I didn't fall over right. Okay, now we got it. How many times do we have to fill it with this now? And okay, can we just get it to tip over at this point? And it's just all these things you think are going to be so simple and easy to do that become unbelievably complicated. Another scene I love from 302 actually is the one where Gordon talks to Joni about how proud he is of her for inviting this girl she doesn't like to her birthday party. And then the reveal that Cameron bribed her with $20 to do it. I love that scene as well. I mean, and that's the thing. Look, this is the thing I'm working on Halt and Catch Fire. The hours were amazing. I mean, Chris really, it was like banker's hours. I mean, it was never any late. Maybe once we had a late night, but sometimes it was like you'd get in at noon and leave at 4. I mean, the hours were so easy, and they would basically just say, "Okay, here's our mission for the day. We have to figure out this story. We have to solve this problem," and you'd really focus on it. And everyone was just really collaborative and building on each other, and that was entirely because of the way Chris ran it. They did a lot of the work themselves on their own to set things up so that we, you know, when they got into the room, they were very clear on what they needed and wanted. And it just, again, being able to contribute to everybody's episode made everyone feel invested in things. You know, I remember I think it's 308, we were describing the internet, and I pitched the image of driving into New York in the tunnel and then emerging and seeing the city in front of you. I said, I don't know if this is a thing that works or not. And Chris Cantwell said, oh no, I love that. It's great. Yeah, I love that as an analogy. And so, like, you know, again, there was a sense that you could fail with a pitch that maybe didn't work, and then they'd like it, or someone would add to it in a way that did make it work. But everyone, Angelina, Mark, Allison, Lisa, the Chris's, it was just it was really the best staffing experience I've ever had. And everyone felt like they really had an investment in the show. Like they were all contributing, their contributions were valued. And so, like, yeah, so it's like you could bring something like the robot butler or me coming up with a pitch for analogy or the AIDS thing that would then inform something or inform someone else's episode, and they'd run with it and take it in another direction. And Angelina, I thought, did a beautiful job with that, where Dawn is in Diane's house and is having that dream about Cameron. I just remember seeing that for the first time and just, you know, I was there when it was pitched. I had an idea what it would look like. And I was like, oh my God, what a beautiful moment that was. And that's the other thing. You get surprised when you see other people's scripts. Like they'll write something and a scene will just be amazing. Or you'll see it when it's filmed. You're like, oh, I never pictured it that way. It's so gorgeous. You know, it was just a show you were really proud to be affiliated with.
Did you have a favorite character to write?
I was always drawn to Gordon because I've always liked that character, almost Gordon from the first season in any ways. I was always drawn to that kind of nerdy, isolated kind of genius kind of character. I was really drawn to Gordon that way. But I love writing Cameron. I liked all of them. Boz. I mean, part of it's hard to divorce the actors. Carrie, you know, who did play Donna, was so great. You know, and they were all different on set to work with and their own ways. You know, Carrie was amazing where she'd have to grill you on everything. Like, why is she doing this? And why is she saying this? And once you were able to answer her questions, she says, okay, I've got it. And she just would be amazing with it. And Mackenzie, just her instincts are just, I don't think that I ever had a note for Mackenzie. She just was amazing with stuff like that. And Scoot would kind of find things, and Lee would like to find things. Lee would like to try stuff out, and maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, but then he'd always land in a place where it worked. I mean, he would just like to experiment sometimes and try things. But I remember Mackenzie in 302. This was a source of frustration where when she and Donna are pitching themselves to Diane, I had a line that was from the time period, if you grew up then, but the script was the speech was originally all Donna's, and the line was something like, we've got the chocolate, you've got the peanut butter, was why they were going to be a good match, which was a ad line from Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. There was a whole ad campaign during that era where people would run into each other on the street, and someone's chocolate would go into someone's peanut butter. You got chocolate on my peanut butter. You got peanut butter on my chocolate. And it was all you got the peanut butter, we got the chocolate. That went together were a great match. That was the line. And the director of that episode suggested that we split the speech up so Cameron and Donna both had part of the speech. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Divide it between the two of them, sure. So we did that. And then Mackenzie said, I don't, that line doesn't work for me, the chocolate and the peanut butter. And the director said, here's the thing. She doesn't know the commercial. She doesn't understand the reference. So I'm going to give you a lesson on how to get an actor to say something. And so she sent her like from YouTube clips of the commercial to explain it to her. I went, okay, great. Then we got to set. I said, so Mackenzie's good with the line now? She goes, what? Oh, no, she's not going to do it. I said, what? I thought you said you were going to convince her to do it. She goes, yeah, she didn't buy that. I was like, okay. So I went to go talk to Mackenzie, and I said, look, I like this line. It's not like it's a critical line for the scene. It's just a color line. It's from the time period, and it's the kind of thing you might say to sell something. And she's like, it just doesn't feel comfortable coming out of my mouth. I don't know why she'd say that. And she had all these reasons. And I kind of went, okay, then don't say it. She's like, really? I said, yeah. She goes, you mean I won? I said, yeah. I said, look, I like the line. I'll be honest with you. I do. But at the end of the day, you're the person who has to sell it. You're the person who has to feel comfortable with it. The scene doesn't live or die whether you have that line in it. So if you really don't want to say it, I'm not going to insist that you say it. And she got so excited with that little victory. She was so charming and funny, just with how thrilled she was to have won that thing. And it was like, yeah, I did like the line, but it's like, look, the scene is more important to me than the line in the end. And I want her to have the scene work so she's able to sell it. And she did, and they were great in it. And, so it's like, you have stuff like that on the set with little give and takes like that sometimes, where you just, have to, sometimes you just have to kind of let the actors do what they need to do. There's times where like, no, this line is critical to the scene, and here's why. And most actors, and certainly the actors on Halt, if you explained why something needed to be a certain way, they'd get it. They were all smart, interesting, curious people. And they would, if you could explain why something had to be a certain way, and they understood you, then, they get it, and they would want to make it work. They were all, that's the thing, when the cast was just so good and so fun to write for. So it's not like I had one favorite character per se. I'd say like maybe Cameron, Boz, and Gordon were ones that I was kind of more instinctively drawn to, but it changed from scene to scene. Sometimes Donna would be the one I would love writing for a scene. Especially when we got her being angry. Like I love writing Donna in that scene in the boardroom, for instance. I just loved the kind of repressed anger she had coming through, and just the sort of, she knew how to cut Cameron to the quick with things. So yeah, it was just one of those shows that it was fun to write everyone.
Oh, it's amazing. I know it's been a strange time in your industry, but as we wrap up here, is there anything that you can talk about that you've worked on recently, or that you've worked on since Halt and Catch Fire, that you want to draw our attention to?
Well, I worked on The Boys, which doesn't need my attention being drawn to. It's immensely popular, but that was a kind of, like I said, I was a comic book nerd growing up. And so getting a chance to do a comic book show, or, every show I've ever written are like people sitting around tables talking, whether it's a sitcom or Mad Men or Halt and Catch Fire. Hell on Wheels was different because it was a Western and you're on horses and stuff. But The Boys was, people jumping off buildings, people flying through walls. That was a real blast for me to be able to be involved in something that kind of to watch that kind of stuff get made, fight scenes. It was really, really cool. I don't have anything currently to direct anyone to. I mean, I've been trying to get certain projects off the ground. It's been proving immensely difficult to do that right now. And if it were just me, I'd be feeling like, oh, maybe I need to reevaluate. but everyone I know, all my peers, everyone I've talked to, it's a really difficult time. And my big concern is if they've really broken the system. I mean, there was a system that worked for everyone. There were flaws. Certain people weren't given opportunities to participate as much as they should. But, if you had managed to carve out a spot for yourself in Hollywood, you could make a living, whether you were on a crew, in an executive, writer, a producer, an actor. People made livings and were able to survive. And COVID accelerated a transition that I think probably would have taken more like 5 years or longer to gradually move into streaming, that abruptly happened like within a few months. And all the major people just went right into streaming and broke the financial system that worked for, in some form for over 100 years. And I don't know if they figured out how to monetize things in a way or make things work right now. And they're desperately trying to, because they're not making profits, and people are getting fired and laid off. Projects aren't happening. Any project that gets through, it's all like, heavily based on IP, which is ludicrous to me. Because if you look at the history of most great television shows, they're from original ideas by writers and not necessarily based on IP. So I'm always an optimist by nature. I think you have to be to work in this industry, because if you don't believe that something positive is going to happen, you'll get destroyed. You kind of have to have faith that something's going to work out, because the odds are always stacked against you, no matter what you're doing. It's a tough industry. But it's the first time I've had a real fear that, are we witnessing a real transition where things are going to really go to hell because of the way the powers that be have made their choices. So yeah, I'm concerned about it. So I'm an optimist, but I've got grave concerns, I guess.
I'm glad that you're sharing that here. I think it's interesting, the people who listen to this, that we are looking to understand the landscape of the industry. And so it's helpful to get a sense of that from a writer's standpoint in particular.
My big fear is the shows that I love as a viewer and the shows I've worked on, shows like Mad Men and Halt and Catch Fire, that are character-driven, idiosyncratic visions. I worry that those shows aren't going to get made quite the same way. And I worry that the incubation for writers on staff to learn their craft, all of the stuff that the writer's strike was about, I worry that the world I cut my teeth in, grew up in, and have lived and thrived in doesn't exist the way that I've known it. And I worry that it's not being replaced by a better system. And I just worry that the ecosystem needed for a good, creative, original shows that me and you, and I'm guessing your audience, are drawn to, is not happening. And television for me is about visiting characters and living in a world that you see week to week, and that you get invested in and care about, and tell emotional human stories that comfort us, challenge us, educate us, enlighten us. I just worry that those shows are going to suffer as they look for what have to be surefire hits or whatever, but just also the shorter length for things. 10 episodes for Halt was tough. If we had 13, it would have been, I think, an even better season. 6 or 8 episodes is really hard. And what happens, like with a show like The Boys, you do 8 episodes, they're done in 2 months, and that's like a year and a half or 2 years for the next season, because it's a big production. It's basically a movie with sequels. It's not a TV show where week to week you're seeing the characters and living with the characters. Those shows that would run for 5, 6, 7, 8 years and become the fabric of your life, and the characters were part of your life. You grew up loving these people, then they're a social connection. I just worry you lose that. You lose kind of the connecting social fabric of people and their favorite shows that are there for them on a regular basis. And that's why I went into TV. It's what I love about TV, and I'm worried that it's disappearing.
Well, we'll have to keep our eyes on that for sure. But thank you. First of all, thank you so much for all the time that you've taken to talk about this show. I'm so glad we were able to hear your perspective on this. If you want to hang out for just a couple of minutes, but to everybody who's watching this, I hope that you learned a lot about the show, about the process of making this show. And I hope that all of you will go out there and watch Halt and Catch Fire.
Worth your time. It's an investment you'll be happy you made. And thank you, Melissa. Look, I could talk about it's an experience I loved, and I can talk about it forever. So, happy to share my thoughts with you.
So amazing. To everybody who's listening, bye.